Yum, yum!
Greg here from Pixel Fondue, and in this video I am going to be talking about texture replicators. So there's a couple of videos on Pixel Fondue already about texture replicators, and there's probably a VOD in 60 seconds as well, so if you want to get the quick lowdown, you can watch that. In this one, I'm going to dive into them a little bit more and into a little more detail. In fact, there's a node called the curve particle generator. And I'm not sure when that showed up, but it's great. It gives great control over replicators and also texture replicators. It gives you control over spacing and scale and some other stuff. And it's really useful. So texture replicators, I think, are often just kind of overlooked in MODO. I think people forget they exist, but they're a really useful texturing tool. So anyway, we've got this sort of sci-fi kit bash pillar thing here, and we'll just use this as our model. And maybe we'll just color this red to make it pop a little more. Sort of a really saturated, bright red. And let's say we want to replicate a decal around this loop here, just like a decal, you know, like some sort of symbol replicated around this loop. And we want to do it with texture replicators instead of UV mapping, because I think we get a little more control ultimately with texture replicators. So, okay, so I've got this loop here, and a texture replicator, just like a regular replicator in MODO, requires a point source. So as you know, if you're familiar with MODO, a replicator, or similar to like a cloner in Cinema 4D, it takes a point source and it takes a prototype. And that prototype can be mesh, like a piece of geometry, or in the case of a texture replicator, it can be an image. And we're gonna do both here, just so you can kind of see how this works. So the first thing I want is a bunch of verts in the middle of this to place my images on. So I'm just gonna loop slice this right in the middle. It's just Alt-C, loop slice. It's also over here under Edit, loop slice. And you can just click and drag. And if you want to right in the middle, just hit Control-D to go reset the tool to the default, which is 50%. And press Q to drop it. Now we've got some edges right in the middle, and if I press Alt-1, I can convert those to verts, and you can kind of see the verts there. So right now we've got a bunch of verts, like circling this a bunch of polys that we want to replicate a texture to, right? And if we just stick with this, we're going to get a texture on every single vertex, which is way too many. So what we want to do, like I said, is get more control over our texturing process. So I'm actually going to Alt-2 to convert this back to edges. And then I'm going to convert these edges to a curve. And so over here under the edge menu, you'll see an edges to curve command down at the bottom. It's also a mesh operation for this because you can do this whole thing procedurally as well if you want to. And I'll just do the command here. We'll just go to the default spline curve, and we're going to create a new mesh. And that's going to give us this curve mesh here. And so we've got the curve mesh, and we've got our mechanical part 9 mesh, this pillar right here. And I think I'm actually going to turn, actually, it's pretty visible. That white curve mesh is pretty visible there. So right now, the curve mesh, again, it has all those verts, but we're going to start adding some more nodes to this to give us some more control, like I said. I'm actually going to set this up with a replicator first, our standard geometry replicator, because texture replicators don't show up in the viewport. They only show up in preview or the rendered image. And so it's a bit of a pain. Hopefully they'll show up in advanced viewport eventually, but right now they don't. So let me just add a mesh prototype here. I'm just going to call this ball, and I'll just do a procedural sphere mesh op here just to give us some geometry, if I can spell sphere. So I'm just putting a sphere here. That's way too big. Let's make it like maybe 10 millimeters across, 0.01. Control-Alt, hold those two down to get it across all 3 channels there. And I'll probably just make this a tessellated sphere. And then I'm going to add a regular replicator to this scene. So let's just add a regular mesh replicator. And this will help us visualize what the curve particle generator is going to do for us. And so a replicator will take a point source, and we're going to use our curve mesh as the point source, and it'll take a prototype, and we'll use the ball as a prototype, and boom, we've got all the little balls around that little loop there. And so now if we're using a texture replicator, we're to replicate an image where each of these balls is. And so what we want is more control over how many balls we have, the scale, and all that kind of stuff. So let's open up the schematic here, and I'm going to drag, I don't need this open, the mesh operations list open. Let me drag the replicator in here and double click on the little yellow dots or diamonds to show the curve mesh going to particle source and the ball going into the prototypes, right? What I want to do is add that curve particle generator node to the scene. So you just type it in, curve particle generator, there it is. And like I said, I'm not sure when this node showed up, maybe MODO 13 or so or 12, but it's super useful. And I'm just going to plug the curve into the curve input, and I'm going to replace the particle source with the output of the curve particle generator node. And right away you'll see there's fewer spheres on our curve. And if I select this, I'll see some parameters. And first of all, you see a point count. So the point count gives us, and obviously it resamples the curve and gives us a point where however many points we want. So we can have 10 or 20 or whatever. So right away we have more control over spacing than just using the verts from the raw curve. And we can also do some stuff like spacing distance and exact distance. And these are actually kind of useful if you want to rig it. So for instance, if this thing is going to be scaling up or down and you always want the exact same sort of spacing between your replicated textures, your replicated geometry, you can rig that up. And we can also do some cool offsetting. And so right now with cluster, if I have offset selected, I'm just going to press C for channel hole, and I'm just going to drag. You can see it's just dragging, it's just offsetting everything. I can kind of animate these around, and it's clustering at the end. We have sort of an end behavior here where it all just sort of clumps up at the end. But I can also turn this to wrap. And what you can see here is I'm doing this with geometry, like a regular replicator, but all this will work with a texture replicator too. So you can imagine like a dotted line or moving arrows or lights or luminous, dots or something like that. You can animate those really easily. You don't have to animate textures or UV parameters. You just animate, these channels on this curve here. I have a start percentage I can animate, right? So I can, that's the percentage of the curve. So I can start at like 33% up the curve or and end 66% of the way. So I've got just like a third of the curve there. And so there's a lot of parameters, like I said, that you can deal with here on this curve and this node. And these will all translate with not just with replicators, but also texture replicators. There's also this, over here on this other tab, there's some more controls. We can adjust the scaling, which is kind of cool. So we have this particle scale gradient. And so I can open this up here. Let me just sort of get a taller view. In fact, let me open up this whole thing into open it in an editor so we can, whoops, not that big. This big is fine, so we can kind of see what we're doing here. And this sort of gives us a gradient along the entire length of the curve that'll control our scale. So right now we're 100% scale at the beginning of the curve, 100% scale at the end of the curve. And if I middle click and put a dot right in the middle of 50%, keep that at 100 and move the beginning and end to say 0%, you can kind of see what's happening here, right? So 0% at the beginning and end of the curve, which is probably right around here. And then it's growing on both sides up to 50% in the middle. So that's kind of cool. And I also have this scale shift offset here, which again, I can just drag. You can kind of see that going. And again, this is sort of this, here's, I have these pulsating spheres. We can imagine this with a circular texture instead of using a texture replicator instead of a sphere with a regular replicator. And again, the reason I'm showing this with the regular replicators is texture replicators don't show up in the viewport. So all this kind of cool stuff I'm showing isn't going to show up with a texture replicator in the viewport. It will when you render it, but hopefully we'll get, again, texture replicators in the viewport eventually. But these are just some of the controls we have. And of course, on the regular replicator, we have other controls like, we can randomize all the the scale and stuff like that. So we can randomize the scale, or we can randomize rotations, or we can even move it up and down like that. In fact, some of these jitter parameters are available in the curve particle generator, and they're actually, again, they're a little more useful. For instance, this one down here, linear position jitter, what that'll do is it'll jitter it along the length of the curve. So not in XYZ space, but in 0 to 100% space along the curve. So if I jitter it, these will get sort of closer or farther apart as the jitter goes, like that. I can also jitter them off the curve with this radius position jitter, so I can jitter them off the curve like that in XYZ space as well, which is kind of cool. And there's some rotation jitter and scale jitter as well. So all kinds of controls, again, just a ton of controls that you can use here. And you can use these with, they'll also just translate to the texture replicators as well. So let's look at texture replicators and see how this looks with a setup with a texture replicator. So I'm gonna hide my schematic for now, and I'll hide this replicator. We'll just keep our curve there. And let's load a couple of images into the scene. So I'm gonna load, okay, here's some decals I bought from, I think, ArtStation maybe. So let me just grab a few of these. I'll grab a circle here And let me grab an arrow. This will be good. And I don't know, maybe I'll grab this U here. So got some images here, and I'm just going to go over here to the shader tree, and let me just turn these guys off. And here's our pillar, right? Let me just actually delete these two. And I'm just going to drag, let's say we'll start with a circle here, drag it in. And so that's just going to default to UV mapping, or cubic mapping in this case, actually. And so, yeah, blah. Now, again, like I've said for the third time, texture replicators do not show up in the viewport. So if this is distracting to you, you can just turn it off by clicking this GL display here and just click it off so this texture is not going to be viewed in GL. And I'll open up a preview window over here. Let me just push in the camera a little bit so we get a better view of what we're doing. And yeah, we'll go back to perspective view. So over here in the texture locator is where all our replicator controls are. So in geometry replication, we've got this whole replicator item, but all those parameters are sort of bundled into the texture locator on any sort of texture you're putting in the shader tree. And it's right here. You got a particle source right here. So I'm going to pick our, now again, I'm not going to pick the curve mesh. I'm going to pick the curve particle generator. So I have all those controls. And so I'm going to pick that. And you can kind of see what's going on over here. Let me actually go back to our curve particle generator. And let me just show this in the schematic. So let me click this out. Now it's hooked up to our replicator, but it's also hooked up to our texture locator as well. And so here's our texture image right here. Here's our texture locator, right here, shader tree, right here in the schematic, and right here is our file name right there. That's the circle. So you see how this is working. We're using the curve as the base. We're modifying it with the curve particle generator node. We're feeding that into the locator as the particle source. And now we've got some control over it. So let me just actually turn some of this stuff back to normal here. Let me just delete a couple curves here. Boom. And make sure our jitters are all back to 0. Okay, so we're good on that. So again, you'll see that this is really big over here. And we have a scale parameter on our texture locator. And so underneath our particle source, you see particle size. And so I'm just going to turn that to what was our spheres, like 0.01 maybe, or 10 millimeters. So you can kind of see what's going on there. That's 10 millimeters. And what that does is basically it's a 10 millimeter sphere of influence. That's the way to think about it. It's this 10 millimeter sphere. So if I actually, let me just bump this up a little bit. So I'm actually just going to press C for channel haul and just sort of drag this bigger. And you can kind of see it over here. Again, I'd love to see it in the viewport. And one of the things you're going to notice is it sort of fades out a little bit towards the edge here. And that's a fade control, this fall off bias and fall off gain. It's actually really useful because you can, again, it's this sphere of influence and we're fading towards the edges of the sphere. It lets us, if we're doing damage or something like that, or scratches, instead of circles, we can fade those into the underlying textures with that parameter. And so if it's really high, it's really soft like that. If we make it really low, like 10%, it's going to have a hard edge, and so we've got it there. Now we see it hitting the top and bottom here, and again, that's our sort of the outer bounds of the particle sphere, this sort of particle size. And our image doesn't go all the way to the edge, right? So there's quite a bit of edge around each side, and so we're getting a bit of a repeat right there. So let's just turn our particle size down a little bit. Whoops, not that much. Like this, maybe. And turn our fall off bias off. So something like that. And again, if you want a little, ideally you would want this clipped to the edges of your image and not with all this, blank space around it. But this works, looks pretty good. Now let's say we want to use some of these parameters with the texture replicator, right? Instead of the regular replicator. We just turn this back to cluster, and for the offset percentage, I'm just gonna again use my channel haul and drag, and you can kind of see these are all being dragged again, like to cluster at the end here, right there. So I drag this forward, or clustering at the end. But you can imagine if I want to put this to, let's say, wrap, and I just drag the offset percentage, you can see them sort of animating around here. So again, this is more useful than a UV map. We can animate them like that. We can also go into our curve, of course, and adjust our curve. So here's our curve vertices. If I just do my little tweak tool here, you can kind of see what I'm doing. Let me find where it is on this. See, I'm moving them around, right? So again, It's not something you would easily do with UV mapping, but I can do this. I can tweak the positions of those really easily, or actually just move this entire curve up or down like that if I want to, which is pretty cool. So there's all that stuff and all the jittering stuff I showed earlier and all the scale stuff. This all works. In fact, let me just show you the scale again with a texture replicator this time instead of a regular replicator. And so maybe I'll move these to up to 50% or so. So again, you can kind of see the scale there on these guys. So let's switch out the circle with an arrow. Let's see if I can find my circle here. Let's pick this arrow. Okay, so now we've got our arrow and it's pointing down everywhere, which is not what we want. And we can do a couple of things here. One, I can just go into my texture locator here and there's a rotation parameter, so I can turn that to 90 degrees. And now they're all facing the way I want. If I want them the other way, I can do 270 or -90, and they're facing the other way. And again, this is, we can animate these things if you want luminous arrows going down a sign or like an LED sign or something like that. This is the way to do it with this curve particle generator node here. Just delete these keys there so we're all the same scale. In fact, if I start tweaking my curve again, let me just do the this little tweak tool and move this up a little bit and move this down a little bit. You'll see that the arrows are, in fact, sort of following the curve and pointing at each other, which is kind of cool. So there's all that. So I can make sure my curve mesh is selected here, and I've got the polygon selected, and I can move this up, and then I can hold Control and Alt and duplicate it just by transforming it with those two keys out, and I've got two of them, right? So let me jump ahead to this other scene here. This is sort of a sci-fi corridor-looking scene with, again, some kit bash geometry. And let's say we've got these 3 floor panels here, and there are 3 different materials, right? So I've got these 3 different panel A, B, and C materials, each a slightly different shade of blue. But I want a texture replicator to paste some decals across all of them, just all at once. And so I can do that as well with a couple of tricks with MODO's shader tree. We just start with this guy here, and let's, in fact, I'll just grab these 2 guys here. Let's copy these 2 polygons, Control C, and press in for a new mesh item. We'll call this curve. We're just gonna make a curve out of this really quickly. Paste those polygons there, and then I'm going to merge those together with merge. Now it's just one. In fact, let me lift it off the floor a little bit there. And then let me grab the 4 corners of that and bevel those vertices and get a nice little vertex bevel, maybe round level of 4 or so. And so now I've got sort of a rounded edges or bullnose looking polygon here, and that's the edge. And again, I'm just going to do the edges to curve commands. We'll do that. And so I created a new curve mesh here. Let's delete those old ones. And so here's our curve mesh, and I can just shrink this down a little and move these verts sort of to the side a bit like that and like this. And let's say I want to replicate some, I don't know, some rivets or something along these guys, or maybe some arrows or something like that. Again, you can, it's a really flexible way of working, but I want them across all 3 of these materials. So let's just move the curves where I want them first. So I'm just going to, again, with the move tool active, Control Shift, holding that down. Whoops, let me select the polygon here, the curve polygon, and Control Shift, holding that down, scooch that over. And here I've got it on this middle one here. Maybe I'll make 2 of them over here, something like this. Like that, and make this a little bit shorter, and again, Control Shift and scooch that over. Sort of quickly do this, and then I'll Control Shift one more time, and rotate this 90 degrees maybe, and Y, and fit this onto these last few panels here, something like that, and then let's use the clone tool just to mix it up. So duplicate, clone. And we'll do replace source and between. I kind of like that, between. So we'll do between the first and the last, and we want, what, 4 of them all together? Or do we want 3 of them? 3 clones, yes, 3 clones in the original one. So, something like that. Good enough. Okay, so now we've got some curves. In fact, let's just go to display and do add draw options and draw style to wireframe and wireframe to user generated color, and we'll make it purple so we can kind of see it better. So those are curves. We're going to use these to place rivets along those floorboards there. And again, our vertices are all just on the corners, but with that curve particle generator node, we can distribute points however we want by resampling those curves. So let me bring up the schematic and bring in my curve mesh here. And let's add a curve particle generator node. Just type it in a little bit better there, Greg. Curve particle generator, there it is. And there's our curve. And then let's go over to the shader tree. And I think I've got, I think in everybody's content directory, you should have a rivet. And let's go to images. Images? Yeah, images. Images, brushes, I think. Bump displacement. Yeah, okay, here's a good one. So this, these curve texture replicators do not seem to work with normal maps, which is weird. I don't know why. Maybe that's a bug. I don't know, but we'll just use a bump map for now. So I'll just plug this little, drag this over here. Again, it goes to, UV or, UV map by default. And so we'll just turn off GL display. And then we're going to pick this curve particle generator 2 as our point source. So here's our in our texture locator, our particle source, so curve particle generator 2. And then let me just activate the preview over here, see what's going on. Got lots of really giant rivets. So let's do a little work with that. I'll just go ahead and click this out so we can see this whole thing there. There's our texture locator. There's our actual texture layer. And of course, here's our image of that in that layer. So let's put the plus there. There's our locator. And so in our locator, let's make our particle size like 0.01 or so, maybe bigger than that, 0.04. Some big, huge rivets that we can see, maybe 0.03. And they're a little bit dense there. So on our curve particle generator, maybe count like 16 or so. So not as many. All these curves are kind of close together. That's fine. We're good with that for now. And you'll notice that it's just on this one panel here because we just have it within this particular material mask here, panel C. But I want them across all of them. So there's a trick we can use for that. So I'm going to grab all three of my panels, A, B, and C. And I'm going to add a selection set. So right now they have a material polygon tag. I'm going to add a polygon selection set tag to these. I'm going to use my little shortcut over here. And I'm going to make sure I'm in poly mode. So I add a polygon selection set. I'm going to say new set. We'll just call these 4 panels. That's our set. And okay. And so if I look at these guys here, I can, they're all on, I'm in poly mode. And they're all 3 selected. So I can select polygons. I can also go over here to stats. And I should be able to see that under polygons and selection set, I have 4 panels there. And it's every single polygon. And all 3 of these guys is in this polygon selection set, right? So there they are. And I can use this in the shader tree as well. So in the shader tree, I've got my panels here, A, B, and C. But I can also add a new group. And this new group I'm going to set it to a selection set instead of a material. So the polygon tag will be a selection set. And we will go with the 4-panel selection set. And I'm going to take my little Phillips guy here, and I'm going to drag it into this one. What you're going to see happen is this is going to overwrite diffuse color on all of these. So now I am texture replicating these rivets across 3 different items with 3 different materials. I'm using this nice little trick in the shader tree by using a selection set tag that all 3 of these 4-board items have in common. And I'm just overlaying this diffuse color texture replicator. I don't want a whole material in here. If I add a whole material, it's going to overwrite everything that's under it, right? So I don't want the whole material there. I already have materials in all these groups. I'm just layering this image here on top of these guys, and that's in diffuse color. But I can just right-click and duplicate and set this to bump as well, right? So I can go to surface shading effects or surface shading and set that to bump. And now I've got a bump effect and a diffuse color effect. So again, normal does not seem to work with texture replicators. I'll have to check and see if that's a bug or not. But again, that's a pretty cool little thing there, right? I can do this with rivets, but I can draw arrows, just draw curves all along this sci-fi corridor wherever I want there to be arrows or decals or numbers or whatever, and I can manipulate the curve with this curve particle generator. I can adjust scale and do all that other cool stuff with it. And it's just a really powerful way of texturing, right? And again, I just created these little curves here, and that's all I have to do. And I can also just use, vertices. Let's just do one more little trick here. And let me just pause this guy. And I'm going to take the wall panel here. I'm just going to borrow one of these vertices from it. Let's just borrow, let's say, this guy right here, one vertex. I'm going to Control-C, copy that, press N for a new empty mesh item. I'm going to paste that vertice in there. I'm going to call this particle verts. And I'm going to, let's see, I'll just look at this in perspective view, I guess. Let's kind of put it in the middle, like that. And I can just use this in a texture replicator. So let's go over to my wall. And here's my wall folder. Or let me just actually delete this. Here's my wall mask. Let's add a couple more images to our scene here. So let's just add a bunch of stuff. Let's add all these skulls, a couple skulls, a hand, some Klingon gibberish, I don't know, a couple symbols, looking good. Maybe, oh, I don't know, maybe a check mark and an X and a couple of signs. All right, hit OK, got all these images in the scene. So again, if I just drag one image here, like this circle, and drag this on top of the wall here, I'm going to get that defaulting to like a UV map. This second wall is just a instance, so it's picking up that same texture there. But I'm going to turn off GL display so that's not distracting. And I'm going to take a look at the texture replicator. And for particle source, this time I'm just going to use that single vert and particle verts. So particle verts like that. And let me fire this up here again. And there we go. So it's just that single vert is giving me that. And again, let me tighten up the boundary there a little bit. And I can go back over here to my particle vert, and I can just select that in vertex mode, and I can move this around and move this guy wherever I want it. I can also copy and paste these. So let's say I Control-C copy and drag it over here and paste back the original one there, and then do the same thing, like copy this and move it over here and paste it back. You can kind of see what's going on there. Let me just kind of move that back in the middle. And so, okay, that looks good. I've got 3 verts here now, so let's just keep doing it. I'm just going to copy and paste and get more and more verts in here. Whoops, let me copy those guys and paste. You can also paint vertices onto geometry. You can, there's all kinds of ways to get verts on geometry in MODO. You can use a surface particle generator and convert them to verts if you want. There's all kinds of ways you can do this. Okay, so let's take a look at our verts here. I've got some particle maps on these, or I can get some particle maps on these, right? So let's add a size map, particle size map. Hit OK. And then I'm just going to use over here, if I, particle size is just a weight, so I can use this, our weighting tool, or adjust weights tool, and you can see the percentages there. So with particle size selected and Shift W or click adjust weights, I can drag these up and down. You can kind of see I can shrink these down if I want to. So I'm adjusting the particle size with this VMAP. So instead of using a node like the curve particle generator, I'm just using it as a VMAP to do this. And it's a super, it's actually super powerful because I can also use a particle transform map, which is transform map right here. Hit OK. I've got a transform map. So if I grab this particle right here in the middle, I've got a transform map on it. I can use just MODO's transform tools on the particle or on the vert. I know it's kind of weird to like scale a vert, but I have this map here, and the scale information is kept in the map. So if I scale this up You see it scaling up here. I'm gonna actually bump into the limits of my particle size, but so here I'm scaling it up. I can even rotate it. So I'm gonna rotate it, and you're seeing these edges rotate here. So that's pretty cool. And so there's just a ton you can do again with these particle texture replicators. In fact, the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go in here. I'm actually going to delete this image out of here, so I'm going to get rid of all of these guys. I'm going to add a new texture item here. Under image map, I'm going to add a new image folder. You see a folder appear here in the shader tree, and you see a folder appear down here in the image folder as well. So inside this folder, I'm going to drag a bunch of these images, all these things I loaded up earlier. Just shift click. I shift click those guys and drag them in here. And it takes a second to update. So there we've got them in the folder, and here you see they're all splashed all over here because again it's defaulting to like a UV map. So let's turn off GL display like we did before. And let's pick under texture locator, let's pick our particle source, which is the particle verts. And here what's interesting is it's randomly picking a particle, it's randomly picking an image out of this folder and assigning it to a particle. It's kind of like having a group of mesh items hooked up to a regular replicator. And you can have like a bunch of points hooked up to the replicator, and it'll just pick a random mesh item and like a random tree or something. That's how you make your forest. Well, you can do that with images too. You just use an image group folder, an image folder, not an image group, an image folder, and you just throw your images into that folder in the image editor here, and there you go. And again, let's just adjust our fall off basis a little bit to tighten those edges up, and let's do let's do some random size maybe. And here you can, this is the type of thing where you can spray a bunch of particles along a surface, and if you want to do some damage or some streaks or some blood splatters, you can do something like that. It's really pretty cool. And so, we have all our, rotate these around. We have all of our attributes here as well. So, here we're just spraying a bunch of random images on the wall. So again, a ton of different options with texture replicators. We can manipulate them with nodes like the curve particle generator node. We can manipulate them with vertex maps as well. And there's just a ton we can do. Like if I want to turn this, again, this check around, I can just rotate it and turn it around, right? So pretty cool use of tools and texturing here, and a lot more useful than just trying to UV map this stuff and for some scenes. So I think I've babbled about this long enough, but you can hopefully kind of see the power of these, and also other things like MODO's ability to do like these floor panel, like using selection sets in the shader tree to layer your images across different materials as well. So pretty cool, and I'll leave it there.
Yum, yum!